Go. All right, here we go.
Are we only expecting 3 of you today? I know Ellie isn't.
I'm just going to get a little. Don't need a quorum. So the work session for the Annapolis City Council will be called to order on Thursday, April 18th, 2024 at 1 minute past 3. At this time, would everyone willing and able please join us for the Pledge of Allegiance? Alderman Savage.
Just to point out for those who came here, there is an accident on the drawbridge, so some people may be stuck in that.
Unless you're on a bike.
Unless you're on a bike.
All right. So, City Attorney, please present the first item or the item on the agenda.
First item on the agenda is ID 6424, Election Task Force Final Report.
Thank you. Please come forward. Thank you.
Want to start? Sure. All right. Hello. Good afternoon.
Good to see you.
I've been asked to present a brief overview of what led to the formation of the task force and the selection process of its members.
Savage.
State your name.
I'm sorry, I should have done that. Eileen Leahy, and I'm the chair of the Board of Elections, or the Board of Supervisors of Elections for Annapolis. And I was also a ex officio non-voting member of the task force.
Thank you. We can do some introductions if you all want to intro.
Sure, do it.
We know that man on the right.
Andrew Miller as a member of the task force and a Ward 1 resident.
Thank you.
Ian Pfeiffer, member of the task force and the chair of the task force.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Excuse me. So after the 2013, 2017, and 2021 elections, the Board of Elections identified the need for changes in the Annapolis City Code in regard to the municipal elections. Some changes were made to areas such as deadlines and canvassing, and there has been an inclusion of a section on independent expenditures, which was adopted in 2021. The 2021 Charter Revision Commission proposed changes to the Charter and City Code, notably in regards to nonpartisan elections, syncing Annapolis municipal elections with the county, and expanding the size of the Board of Supervisors of Elections. Then, with the advent of mail-in voting during COVID and election law changes at the state and federal levels, BOES recognized the necessity and the opportunity to review and evaluate Annapolis election law more thoroughly. Thus, BOES requested and City Council approved the formation of a task force to study and make recommendations to improve election laws and processes for Annapolis municipal elections. The task force was required to submit a final report, and that is what we're reviewing today. A public application process was conducted in late fall of 2022 by the Annapolis Board of Elections. Individuals with experience and/or expertise in election law and procedures were invited to apply for a position on the task force. A press release was sent out and was picked up by the Capitol newspaper and other news organizations. Community and political groups in the city and county were notified via email, and the application was posted on the website. Applicants were asked to submit resumes and give information regarding city residency, voter registration status, and political party affiliation. Of particular importance was the applicant's explanation of their interest in being appointed to the task force and what they could bring to the group. They were also asked to list their experiences and/or expertise in election law or procedures. So some of the demographics of the group that we got were, there were 16 applications received, One of those was disqualified because it was late. Of those 15, 11 were men, 4 women. 10 applicants were registered Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 4 unaffiliated. 11 were residents of the city of Annapolis and came from wards 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7. 6 were non-residents living either in Bowie, Baltimore, or other places in Anne Arundel County. The applications were reviewed at the January 2023 BOES meeting. And the goal was to constitute a politically and demographically diverse group with the required experience. 5 individuals were selected and given as recommendations to Mayor Buckley. The group included 4 men and 1 woman, 3 Democrats and 2 unaffiliated, 3 resided in the city of Annapolis, and 2 who were former residents but currently living in Anne Arundel County. All had experience with elections and/or judicial legislative processes, such as a former candidate, election judge, campaign worker, current election official, educator, and administrator. Mayor Buckley subsequently nominated those individuals to serve, and they were confirmed on February 13th. And the members were Ian Pfeiffer, Andrew Miller, Faye Gaskin, Scott Gibson, John Michael Gudner, and then myself as an ex officio. The task force was sworn in and met for the first time on April 13th. Ian Pfeiffer was elected as chair and Scott Gibson as secretary.
Thank you, Eileen. I'm going to try and give you just sort of a broad overview. Obviously, you have the full report, and obviously, if you have questions as we get to that point, that would be super helpful. But I'll give you a little overview of how we met, who we met with, and how we tried to sort of take in the information, and then really some of the trends we saw that coming out of that, which rolls up to sort of one of the bigger recommendations in here. And then Andrew will talk a little about some of the other recommendations that are in the package. So basically, in that 6-month window, we had about 10 meetings. We had 2 public hearings. We had a sort of a work session at Pitt Moyer, and then actually in this room had another public hearing and an online public hearing. So we tried to look for different opportunities to get input from folks in the community. We met with folks from the State Board of Elections. We met with folks from the County Board of Elections. We met with folks in the city who handle our elections in the Office of Law and Regina. We met with a number of sort of interested parties in that way. And I think what was kind of interesting to us as we thought about it, sort of how the elections have evolved here in the city over time, that it's clear that, a couple election cycles ago, the city would under Regina's leadership, would go out and hire someone to help us implement the election. We would sort of do it all on our own with our own code. And over time, in the last couple cycles, a partnership was struck with the county, which was able to, they're a much larger Board of Elections, to be able to take on some of that work to help us. Is obviously a cost savings to the city to do that, sort of a different level of sophistication maybe about sort of how that work gets done, which has been sort of, a big benefit, I think, sort of how we've got here. The challenge really is sort of like, from our perspective, is like, where do we go from here? As we looked into it, the code itself, sort of offers real challenges, because like what has happened over time, every session of the legislature, there are new election bills that impact what happens with the 24 county, sort of Board of Elections. It is a constant sort of process of renewal, of changing what's happening there, adding new elements to it to make it easier for folks to vote. And really, cities like us are sort of outside of that process. So we end up with a code that has pieces that are sort of from a different era, pieces that don't sort of fit what's happening now. And for all of us who vote and live in this community, you go vote for in the governor's election, or you vote for the presidential election, and you have the ability to do same-day registration. You have the ability to do, permanent mail ballot. You have the ability to sort of do early voting at early voting places. All those things that have come into the process in how the county and the state work together, that we are sort of on the outside of. So I think, one clear recommendation is that the code is sort of a challenge and needs to be implemented in some way. But really, if we're going down the road towards more partnership with the county, which is sort of one of the core recommendations we end up making, in some ways those problems would take care of themselves. But I think like the other sort of big learning points across the input we received was, if you look back over a number of cycles, the turnout is certainly lower than what we see from within the city on the even years, right? So what we see in presidential years or in state election years. the level of people who are filing to run, right, has been traditionally low, right? So, like, you know, we approached it because we have such a background, a mix of backgrounds. People who've been candidates and been treasurers, people who have academic background, people who've worked in Board of Elections in other counties, trying to think about sort of like, what are the core goals, right? The core goal, from my perspective, is how do we get more people involved? How do we get more people to be able to vote, make it easier to do so? And how do we get more people to run? And our elections are better when there's much more sort of, sort of involvement in that way. So, you know, we sort of identified that as a challenge. Andrew will talk a little bit about sort of the party primary dynamic. I know it's been, when I was on the council here 10 years ago or longer, we debated this question. I'm looking at my friend Rob. When I was sitting in that seat, he was on the other side arguing we should tweak the party system. So I think, you know, there is certainly a limitation when 20% of the registered voters in the city are not Republican or Democrat, so they don't have a role in choosing what happens in the primaries. That is definitely a limiting factor to who gets to choose who's leading the city, because so much of what happens in the primaries, and we often don't have very contested general elections as a result of that. So these are sort of things that, if what we're trying to get is more participation, get more voices involved, we want to think about. The biggest sort of recommendation that you'll see is suggesting that the city move forward with the county to basically try to merge our elections into the county elections. And obviously, you all hear a lot from people always, like, you know, are there things that are where there's duplication between what the city does and what the county does? This seems to be an issue where it certainly is. They are much more, have much more capacity to do elections. I talked a little bit about their interplay with the state. So as new sort of voting trends come online, they are going to come to the county first. And, you know, there's interest in ranked choice voting and a variety of other tools, just like same-day registration and early voting that have been introduced the last couple of years. In the next few years, obviously, if you move towards a county system, you would basically benefit from that. We all know the reason why it hasn't happened is it's hard, because you would have to basically get the city and the county and maybe the legislature to agree to alter the terms. You would ask people to run for a term that may be 3 years or 5 years the next time to get on cycle. It's a 10-year proposition to kind of get from where we are to there. But the upsides, we think, if someone is willing to champion and try and figure it out, in the long run, it is much better. Because if you are on the presidential ballot as the city elections, or you are on the gubernatorial ballot, you would basically have that much more turnout, that much more voters focus. You'd benefit from all the different systems that are in place at the state and at the county to get more people energized. An argument that was made when I was here against that is, well, people won't get all the way down from the ballot. They'll vote for president and they'll vote for Senate, and they won't. You know, I mean, I think the question really is that if that's true, how would we know, right? And obviously, when we run our elections the way we have always run them on a year by ourselves, we see what the turnout is versus what the amount of people within the city limits who show up to vote for governor or vote for president. So, you know, if what we want is more people involved in the process for a healthier democracy, that's probably something to consider. So, a big focus of the report, as you look at it, sort of talks about that, and that a lot of things would flow from that, right? So, we have proposals around ranked choice voting and around blanket primaries. So some of those would, you know, if you were to go down the road, it's sort of like you have to figure out that question first before you decide what else to implement. If you decide not to advance trying to figure out how to restructure and go on to a different election cycle, then in the context of running our elections in partnership with help from the county, you can figure out, you know, changes you can make within the structure as it is. So we view it as sort of the big either or choice, and then a bunch of other sort of recommendations that flow based on what you decide to do about that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew to talk about a bunch of the other recommendations we thought about and made.
Right. Thank you, Ing. Thank you all for authorizing this task force, for giving attention to elections. I know it gets a lot of attention at the national level, but definitely not so much at the local level. So I appreciate you all doing this. So I'm going to be talking about some of the recommendations that we're calling just kind of non-core recommendations that are in addition to what Ian has just mentioned. So I'm going to organize these recommendations into 3 buckets. The first set of recommendations look to boosting competitiveness The second set of recommendations look to getting greater involvement for unaffiliated and voters who are inclined to vote for third parties, that sort of thing. And then we kind of have a miscellaneous set of recommendations. So with respect to increasing competition, the task force recommended potentially adopting a public finance system similar to what you have at the county level to reduce the barrier of funding, financing for candidates getting into races. We also recommended creating a fully independent redistricting task force. I know you all are going through redistricting at the moment, and you've gone some steps in that direction with having a redistricting task force, but we're suggesting that that become fully implemented, and that should facilitate the drawing of boundaries in a way that is most competitive for incumbents, challengers, and the like. It was interesting, a couple days after we submitted this report, a Baltimore City Council member introduced a bill that would have a similar redistricting committee, very similar to what we had in the report in Baltimore. So I'm not sure the status of that, but this is something that's being talked about outside of jurisdictions of Annapolis. It's not just Annapolis. Additionally, to increase competitiveness, we think it would be helpful to allow voters to vote for up to 2 individuals in the primary, and those 2 individuals then would move on to the general election. So this is a form of what's called approval voting. It's again something that's been, I guess, becoming increasingly popular at a national level. Seattle's implemented a form of it. Other municipalities have implemented a form of it. But basically what this allows individuals or candidates, potential candidates who have similar ideologies to both enter into an election without fear of splitting the vote. So if we could put it in like very simple terms, let's say you have 3 candidates in a given primary, and then 2 would move on to the general election. If 2 candidates have a ideology A and 1 candidate has ideology B, even if a majority of voters prefer ideology A, they might split the vote between those 2 candidates, and that candidate with ideology B would be the one that moves on, even though they're the minority opinion or the minority preference for voters. So approval voting is like a very simple way of getting around that problem, and hopefully would encourage, incentivize more candidates getting into races. Right? So that's increasing competition. The second goal, as we talked about, was greater involvement of voters who are unaffiliated or may be inclined to vote for a third party. So we're arguing, or we recommend having a blanket nonpartisan primary. So what that involves is, for the primary process, all voters vote in one primary. There's no Democrat primary or Republican primary. It's one primary. All the candidates are listed on a single primary ballot, and it's open for anybody to vote, any registered voter, of course, to vote. So it's not restricted to just Democrats voting for Democratic candidates and Republicans voting for just Republican candidates. Everybody's on a single ballot, and then the top 2 vote getters would move on to the general election. And a number of other municipalities have that. This certainly wouldn't be something new that Annapolis is doing. In addition to that, for getting greater involvement of unaffiliated and third-party voters, we think the Board of Supervisors election should be expanded, and it should be made such that unaffiliated individuals can have a seat on that board, which is, depending on how you interpret the code, you can maybe do that, but it's very difficult to happen based on the code as it currently stands. And there's been some discussion, and I think, Eileen, you could speak to this better than I can, about what would happen to the Board of Supervisors elections if we went to the county, or if we started to have the county administrate our elections. There are things that the Board of Supervisors elections could do, even if it was the county administrating the elections. For instance, we recommended that the Board of Supervisors elections look at steps to make the vote, I don't want to say they're inaccurate because that would be wrong, but to maximize the accuracy of the voter rolls as they stand in the city, right? And there's a number of municipalities around the country that are grappling with this very same issue. So for instance, one of the things that a Board of Supervisors election could do in a world where they're not directly administrating the election would be to look to ways to improve the accuracy of the voting rolls and that sort of thing. So that's just one thing. Okay. Third bucket of recommendations here, these are kind of a hodgepodge, they're miscellaneous, but we recommended that the ballot question process, so for voters to get a ballot question on the ballot is unclear right now for voters, and there's some concern about that. I think there's been attempts to do that, so we think it's important that that process is clarified so voters have a clear idea of what needs to be done to get a question on the ballot. We also think it would be helpful to have a searchable database of campaign finance contributions. This is something that's, I think, standard practice or becoming standard practice, where people could easily download campaign finance contributions, not just like a PDF for each candidate, but a database where a entity could be searched for, and then all the contributions from that entity could be easily identified. So just increasing the transparency in that respect. And then finally, third miscellaneous recommendation here is it was recommended that term limits be implemented for council members would be 3 4-year terms would be the limits. So in conclusion here, I would say there's kind of two paths that the council could take here. One path would be to implement the core recommendations, which I think would put us at a parity with a lot of the other municipalities in Maryland and around the country. Or we can try to implement some of these recommendations that may have gone kind of beyond what you all originally envisioned or what folks originally envisioned when they set up the task force, but would be helpful for making Annapolis a leader, a model in electoral governance in Maryland, in the state here, and hopefully other municipalities would see what works in this city. So the report here offers a blueprint for that, and we hope you take it up. So thank you.
All right. Alderman Savage had his hand up first. Yeah. Thank you. First of all, thank you. We're lucky to have this kind of quality, and we appreciate all the work that you put into this. And so, sounds like someone else's problem, though, but I'm nearly out of here. No. Alderman Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you. I think frankly, we should probably get this program to get this kind of recommendation done more regularly. So appreciate the time spent on this. I think a number of these we definitely need to, put on the future agenda for discussion. I'm not sure how much we could get done before the next election. I don't know I think we ran into this last term as far as wanting to make some changes, but we kind of ran out of time because we had to make certain reports to the state about what our elections are going to look like. So first question is there a date that we would need to get these changes in, or are you looking for beyond this next election?
Asking me? Do you want to answer it? Well, there are a number of things that the Board of Supervisors of Elections have already started initiating. So I expect by the next election, we'll have an answer for the ballot question. It's actually being proposed legislation for the ballot question, for revising that. We are
For the
also
ballot question standards?
The code as it is written now pretty much follows a lot of the state, but we don't have, what we're missing is a percentage of voters that need to sign the petition to get on the ballot. Right. So the legislation is looking at identifying that number, and it's also looking at allowing the city council to put a ballot question, because currently that's not, state law doesn't address the municipalities for that. So right. I expect the council should be seeing that in the next few weeks. So that's in the works. And I will be actually discussing or hopefully finalizing that at tonight's meeting. So that's one thing that we've started. We've also started looking at the voter rolls. Now, the voter rolls are controlled by the county. So the city really doesn't have as much to do with the actual voter rolls and registration. What we can do at our level is do a communication plan in terms of encouraging people to keep their addresses updated, notify the Board of Elections that they've changed or somebody's moved on. One of the steps we're taking in the current election is we're going to include a box on the outside of the envelope, which the county is now doing, which says very clearly, if this person is not at this address, return to the Board of Elections. When we did that in our last election, we didn't have that, and so some people would get it and not know what to do with it. So we're going to try to communicate that more. So people really just need to say undeliverable and toss it in a drop box or put it back into the mail. So hopefully that will at least help. We're going to look at, one of our members is going to be looking or trying to work with the county to find out maybe what they're doing and see if we can also assist with that. But again, because the voter rolls are held by the county, our area looks like it'll be mostly communication. We've been looking at other best practices where mail-in ballots are now, absentee ballots have been replaced by mail-in ballots at the state level. And so the board is also proposing legislation for changing that. And so you'll be seeing that probably in the next few weeks also. So a lot of what we're trying to do at this point is at least become consistent with state law, and that's also one of the recommendations of the task force, is to get in sync with state law. Again, if we were to sync with the county in terms of elections, that would almost be an automatic, because there are some things that are still different. Nothing that's insurmountable, but it does make it, you know, one of the things that we stress from the board standpoint is, for the voter standpoint, let's make it consistent and clear. And so it's hard when a voter in Annapolis, for instance, goes to one polling place for this election, goes to a polling place for that election, does this for that election, does this for that election. And so that is something that we're also trying to merge as best we can. Things such as we've looked at, we've discussed doing the open ballot concept or for approval voting. That is something that may actually need legislation at the state level to allow us to do that. And that's where you would have all eligible registered voters vote on one ballot. And so that's certainly something that I think the board is interested in pursuing. But again, probably not for the next election, because I believe it's going to need state approval. And a lot of what we do will eventually need state approval. One of the other things we'd like to do, and we actually looked into in the past, was what Andrew mentioned as far as the finance reporting system. We tried about 3 years ago to hook in with the state system. And unfortunately, the vendor for the state system said, oh, we'll design you your own for $300,000. And when we asked could we piggyback, the answer was no. So these, you know, that brings up the point that a lot of running your own election is costly. So some of the things we want to do, we're held back from in terms of technologies. For instance, we don't have early voting. We won't have it because of technology. Having the ability to, for our voters to be able to go in and see if their ballot has been accepted. We don't have that because we can't tap into that technology. That would change if we did go more with the county. Now, the technology, the state is going to be revising their election technology and buying more hardware and software in the next coming years. And so we've made some contacts with the comptroller's office and hopefully through some of our state legislators to see if we can't maybe get a little bit more technology. But those are some of the practical things that when you look at the recommendations, the practicality is we'd like to do some of these things, but we can't. We don't either have access, or if you want access, it costs money.
I'd just offer one quick thought, and Eileen's the expert on sort of all the stuff that's happening, which is great. I think at an earlier version, before we got to the final report, one of the things we were really thinking about was this question about how things get set to a referendum in the city. And there was no, like, it was challenging to get sort of an answer of how you would counted and what would be required, because it sort of hasn't been tested for a long, long time. So, and all the counties have the ability to, the legislative body can send things to referendum. Happens all the time. And then there's a public-driven process where also the people could get stuff on the ballot. But I think, like, in the context of the time before the election season starts, and obviously once people start filing, right, then you have to live by the ground rules you've put in place. So, but like, if there was a way to figure out how to pass something that would clarify or add standards to it, and about how the referendum process would work, I think a lot of these other future recommendations, the 10-year sort of things we're talking about the county, it would be the perfect venue to sort of consider those, right, is by sending it, which I think is what Hagerstown just did in the last couple of years. They did sort of a public referendum to say, should we go with the county for the elections to the city? So, like, there's precedent in the state, and it's actually probably a much cleaner way than to be, like, trying to weigh it in the context of here. It strikes me as, like, if you had that tool available, it would actually be much cleaner to consider these much bigger sort of decade-long changes.
Well, could we, the other question with that would be, would the referendums be binding or non-binding, or both? Is that kind of up to the determination of the council or who's petitioning? Because I think out in, was it Frederick or something? I think they had one, but I don't think it was binding.
I'm sorry, what's that?
In Frederick, I think they had a referendum
was binding.
nonpartisan, but I don't think it was binding. Right?
Well, most of them are binding.
Okay.
Excuse me. Rockville has what they call, I can't remember the exact word, but it's mostly a recommendation. So theirs is a non-binding. We've gone back and forth in terms of binding versus non-binding at the board. Currently, the current proposal is for binding. You could start putting in lots of different things as far as percentages. I mean, you can make it as complex as you want it to be, but we're trying to keep it fairly simple.
Yeah.
The idea also, the push towards the ballot question has really come up because for the past 3 charter revision commissions, they've promoted, we need to be thinking about nonpartisan elections. We need to be doing things differently. And it never gets past the city council. So I know from that group, the thought was, let's ask the people. Let's put it as a ballot question and find out what they want. And maybe that's the way to go. So that's an advantage for it. It's also not, there's also a balance with ballot questions. You want to make it accessible and easy for people to put questions on the ballot, but you also don't want to make it too easy so that you're getting a lot of different things. So it's giving that balance.
And they can also be abused, right? Because I know my understanding is the one they had in Baltimore regarding term limits on their council, you had a number of outside groups on one end of the political spectrum that put a lot of money into that race. And particularly, I don't know how well worded the question was. If you just ask people, and that's kind of one of my comments on your survey, it was great to see that you reached a good number of people, 600 some people, I think. But some of the questions were there wasn't, so for some of the referendums, you see that they actually make an argument about for and against, right? And I think that's important to provide, because if you just provide a question of should there be term limits, well, most people are probably going to say yes, unless you make the point that, well, what if that overall impacts the ability of the body to function, right? Because I think it's certainly, personally, I've just seen, I think it's good to have a good mix of experience and non-experience. And I think, like our council in particular, we've gotten to a really good point where we operate pretty smoothly at this point, and due to the mixture of experience. So I'd hate to see, just as an example, like a body be hampered by that. It'd be good to make sure that during the referendum process that, one, both sides of the arguments are presented, but two, what about limiting, as far as outside influence money being, how do you limit the amount of money that can be spent on those kind of campaigns, if that makes sense?
Well, public financing can help somewhat with that. But all of that does have to be followed. So, I mean, if there is a group that's going to bring a ballot, want to put a question on the ballot, they have to have a committee. So they have to have a committee and they have to have a reporting mechanism for the contributions.
Right, okay.
So that's already outlined in the code and is pretty consistent with the state. Again, what isn't in there is the specifics as far as how many voters need to sign the petition. So, for instance, some places it says 20% of registered voters as of a certain date. Some may, I think for the governors, for a charter, it's something like 4% of the number of voters who voted for the governor. So I mean, it can have all permutations. What we're looking at now is probably somewhere around 10, 15% of registered voters as of January 1. But we've also discussed, we want to make sure that this is something that involves the whole city. So that's another way of looking at it. Do you want to make it so that of those 10%, so let's say we have 30,000 registered voters, so you would need 3,000. Do you also want to make sure that all 3,000 aren't from one ward or from one consolidated ward? So we're also looking at saying, okay, it could be 10% of the registered voters, but you have to have at least 250 in each of the wards. So those are the types of things that we're looking at, because we also want to make it consistent across the city and not just ward-centric. So those are some of the, again, the fine things, tweaking that we're trying to do.
The other, I'll take a break after this question, but the other question related to the nonpartisan was, you also mentioned that when you looked at the averages, it was what average of 1.8 candidates for alderperson races, not counting the mayor, right? So 1.8 people, which means what, I guess 20% of the time you have races that are unopposed. So the issue is, which you said, is that we don't often have a lot of interest in people running for this office. Maybe it has to do with the pay, but you know, so when you have term limits, the other side of that argument is, well, you don't have a huge amount of people who want to actually run for this position. I heard you propose, I was going to ask, well, what do you propose to kind of correct to get more people to run? And you mentioned a couple things, right? I think as far as how do you get more interest in, and one of them I think was, well, actually you wouldn't just, public financing was one, right? You mentioned, which I think is a great idea. Was there anything else that you would recommend to boost the amount of people running for office?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of these recommendations are like cross-cutting, where they'll address like a couple of different issues. But we mentioned public financing. We mentioned creating like a fully independent redistricting committee so that district wards are designed in such a way that they would be the most competitive, right? So it would be easiest for or facilitate opposition candidates running. So that was the second one. The third one was creating a system. So this is sometimes called approval voting. Don't want to get into the weeds here, but you create a system where in the primary you have a single ballot, no party, everybody's allowed to run, or everybody's allowed who's eligible to vote on that ballot, and people can vote for more than one candidate to move on to the general election. They could vote for up to 2 candidates to move on for the general election. So that's it. It's a very simple change, but it's very potentially potent with respect to increasing the number of people who have run, because a lot of people are discouraged from running if they feel that somebody has like a similar ideology as them. They're not going to run, because if they run, that means that they could potentially split the vote with that other candidate that's similar to them, and therefore both of them would lose, and then the candidate with an opposing ideology would win. So if you allow voters to vote for more than one candidate in the primary elections, it encourages people to get in, because that means that even if there's somebody that's similar, the voters can vote for 2 people, which means they could vote for that candidate who's similar and the individual candidate who's considering running. So those are ways in which you can encourage increased competition. Those are some of the ways. There's other ways, but those are the ones that we recommended.
I mean, also allowing unaffiliated candidates to run. I mean, right now, if you want to run for an office, you know, to run for alderman, you need to get 100 signed petitions. Now, some people will say, well, if you can't get 100 signatures, how can you win? But again, that's an obstacle. the money's an obstacle. But again, it's also engaging unaffiliated voters. Currently in Annapolis, about 30% of our voters are registered as unaffiliated. And that's pretty much a national trend that unaffiliated are out there. So if they feel included, they may start voting. As the system is now, they can't be on the ballot unless they petition.
Yeah, I certainly agree with it. I think we do need to figure out a way to reach out to unaffiliateds. So, yeah, because I think it's interesting to note that there are more unaffiliateds than Republicans in Annapolis now. But it was also interesting to note that in your survey of 600, unaffiliateds, I think, were only about a third of those. No, less than that, because most of the respondents were Democrats. The other largest percentage were Republicans, with unaffiliated kind of lower down. So they should have been equal. I don't know if that's because unaffiliated traditionally aren't all that engaged, maybe, perhaps as much as the party. But
I mean, there are other models that might possibly be able to be implemented without state changes. I'd have to check this, but for instance, there are scenarios where you keep the Democrat and the Republican ballot, but unaffiliated can go in and request what ballot they want. You could also make it so that anybody could request the ballot. So you keep it as a party system, but you can open up the options for who can vote. That's another way of doing it.
and the other response just to the creating competitive districts is, I don't know how you do that in a city where it is going to be, I don't know, what is, but 50% roughly Democrats, only 25% Republicans. You can't make it competitive based on political party, right? So the emphasis from our recent redistricting task force was getting demographic parity, but also balancing that with keeping communities together. I think they did a good job of that. But so I'm not sure that you can do the competitive in this, unless I'm thinking of it wrong. I'm not sure how you could do that in our city. But that's all for now. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Alderman Finlayson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I'm afraid my hearing aids aren't working really well today, so forgive me if I ask questions already been asked. I have not had the opportunity to see the report, so I don't know whether the details are in the report. But my first question has to do with the down ballot research. Mr. Pfeiffer mentioned, Alderman Pfeiffer mentioned the fact that it would generate more voters because they would be voting for the up ballot candidates. But what does that say about the down ballot candidates? Was there any research to show that after a certain point, people stop voting? You know, think back to our last election and it had all these questions on it. And I know a lot of people didn't finish all of those questions. And imagine if we were after those ballot initiatives, those questions, where our elections would fall. So that's my first question about the research to indicate that down ballot candidates don't lose out.
I'm not sure about any actual research. I do know that when David Garris of the county has been asked about it, they don't see a lot of people not voting at the end. So that's the way to look at it, is to see who votes and then how many at the end just don't keep going. You also have the opposite, where people may come in and just vote for the city and not do the top part either. I think there's some pros and cons to whether you pick a presidential or a county year in terms of name recognition and also from the candidate's standpoint. There had been some talk about, could we have a separate ballot? So if people came in and, you know, you have your ballot for the presidential or the federal, and then you can have a city ballot. So that has been, and I don't think David ever got back to us about that, but I think there could be some logistical challenges with that. But again, those questions are being asked. The trend in Maryland is, again, for syncing in with the county from a fiscal standpoint and from a consistency standpoint for the voters. That's just there. I could certainly check with constituencies such as Hagerstown to see if what their feedback has been. And I'm happy to do that to find out if they felt that, but from what I've heard from Hagerstown, they're pretty happy with how it's going, but I'll ask.
Did they recently change?
Yes.
Okay.
They had a ballot question that the city council, the mayor and the city council put on on, and then it was voted. So it was I don't know if it was binding, but they went with that. So I can't remember what year it was, but it's fairly recent.
I would just offer one thought. I'm not sure, sort of how much research there is, but I'm sure the people at the county could show you over a number of cycles what the drop off is just when they have ballot questions or they have other stuff. I think, the real question is whatever percent you would try and think that might be by going on their ballots drop off, are there still more voters in the city limits who show up in a gubernatorial year and a presidential year than show up when we hold our elections? And my guess is it actually comes out, in the favor. There's more people who would touch that ballot, but it's a good question.
And of course, we don't want less. If
Of course.
this comes out to be equal, then.
No, yeah, I mean, the hope would be it would be substantially more, right? So, I'm with you.
My next question, some of your recommendations, were they recommendations? I know we're trying to clean up our code as far as the election is concerned, but did the state changes point you in the direction, for example, to nonpartisan elections? Or was that just simply a decision that we should be making in the city?
Well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the Charter Commission recommended that as well. So I think that was like the seed that made us initially start talking about it, right, was the fact that it's already been recommended by the Charter Commission, and part of the task force's efforts or the goal, the mission was to evaluate and think about how you would implement those nonpartisan primaries if we thought they were a good idea based on the Charter Commission's recommendation. So that was, I think, the initial reasoning for evaluating them, and it was reinforced by the fact that we have this number of 20 to 30% of individuals who are unaffiliated in the city. So it's a way to give them some involvement. So I think that was the primary driver behind considering them.
I mean, the state currently is not going in a nonpartisan direction. But there are other municipalities that do have nonpartisan elections. But again, there's a difference. There's nonpartisan elections in regards to how you put your ballot, but also in terms, you have to think about who you're allowing to vote. So they're really two different tracks. Thank you.
I didn't quite understand, well, I do understand, you repeated that. The comment about increasing participation if we redrew the boundaries, if there was a redistricting committee. I think our elections have been pretty fair and balanced. So what would you be trying to accomplish by changing our boundaries as they are today?
Sure. So that, to be clear, that wasn't a comment or an observation on past practice or current practice, here in Annapolis. Talking in very general terms here, right? So if redistricting is not done independently, and you can see this at a national level, if the redistricting process is not independent to input from the incumbent parties, there's vulnerability that the incumbent parties can draw districts in such a way that would give them an advantage, right? So I'm not saying, and the task force isn't saying that's what's happening or there's an imminent danger of that happening in Annapolis. What it's saying here is that, as is occurring in other municipalities around the country, is best to put that in the hands of an independent commission that doesn't have where the incumbent individuals don't have a veto over whether or not certain boundaries get drawn in a certain way. So much more general, much more kind of forward thinking rather than thinking about what has happened or what is the current situation here.
Was there any discussion about minority participation?
For the redistricting commission
or for just voting turnout period, which of course would be impacted by redistricting?
So I'm trying to think of ways in which redistricting would affect minority participation, right? So like, if we're talking about in like very general terms, right? Like talking about at a national level, right? If you have gerrymandering occurring, right? You can do what's called like cracking a minority, right? This happened, obviously, we all know about along racial lines where where certain parties who were doing the gerrymandering would break up a minority group so that they didn't have a majority in any given district, right? So if you have a fully independent commission, you avoid those potential problems, right? So I don't think we got as far as talking about minority participation with respect to an independent commission. What we were talking about mainly was getting a fully independent commission that doesn't have the potential for incumbents drawing the lines in a given way, in some way.
Well, I'm very pleased to say we just did our redistricting, and I think we had a pretty balanced committee, and they gave us some pretty good recommendations, and I think we were all pleased to endorse what was presented to us. Accuracy of rolls. You made a comment about the need to make sure our voting rolls were accurate. Have we had any incidents of and Eileen, Ms. Leahy, I'm sorry, this is probably for you since you've been here. Do we have that? You know, there's a lot of national issue about voter rolls
It's a
being
challenge.
inaccurate.
In the 2021 election, because we sent out ballots to everyone in the city of Annapolis, which is just about 29,000, the numbers change all the time, probably like 28,000. We did see a very high number of undeliverables, or a lot of people saying, we got this person isn't here. You'll see it a lot of times, not just in houses, but particularly in apartments. I would say we probably had about 1,500, which I think is, 1,500 more than we want. We have been asking the questions. People say that the process is difficult because you actually have to write a letter. On the other hand, you don't want to make it easy so that somebody can just go into the database and make changes for a lot of people. So we're hoping the board, one of the members of the board is going to be looking into that a little bit more to see what we can do. But we thought at least just communicating it. It tends to be, your kids move away from college and, and they don't update. The state of Maryland is part of ERIC, which is an electronic system that's shared among a number of states that they do cross-check. So they'll send it, hey, someone's registered in this state, and they'll send it back to Maryland. That's not foolproof, though, and actually in the past few years, some states have withdrawn from it. But that is something. The county gets updates from the health department in terms of who dies and those sorts of things. So we're looking to see if we can do better.
So offer one thought. I'm reminded of one of our task force members works full-time in another county board of election in a different part of the state. And, when we talked about this, he said, this is the challenge of every board of election, right? You're continually trying to figure out how to sort of keep the voter roll as current as you can, knowing that people move across town or across to a different county and just don't adjust because if they're, so like it is a constant effort, I think, and takes money and time to figure out how to sort of, continually chase it. But yeah, I think Eileen's point is right. It's like, 1,500 is still a lot, right? So like how do you sort of invest the resources to figure out how to do that?
And it also is money for candidates. I mean, it's money for candidates and just for the city in general in terms of planning for those people that you find out aren't on the rolls.
Well, I think being aware of the potential problem is the key, because then you stay on top of it. And when there are errors or mistakes, you can catch it. So it's just not ignored.
We did see a number of, in the last election when we did mail-in ballots, we did see an increase in the number of people that hadn't voted in a while. So there was certainly the access helped with turnover. And you're seeing that on a national level too, that there's more, for some people it's more access. And that's a good thing too. So our turnout in our last election did go up to 40%, which is the highest it's been in a while.
Well, that's a good thing. My last question has to do with finance, what do you call it, when we submit our fiscal stuff. And I believe all of our information is online, so I'm not sure the need of a database. What would the benefit be over the fact that anyone can go in and look at my campaign list at any time? And people have done that. You know, so are we fixing something there, or?
I think fixing would imply like it's broken, which I don't think it's broken, right? I think this would be like enhancing what currently exists, right? So right now, to my understanding, is that there are individual PDFs per candidate. Is that correct, Eileen? It's like an individual PDF for a given
Each
candidate.
time you file. there's
Each time you file, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, each report is a PDF fillable file, but then it's scanned and
Campaign
posted
fund
on the
report,
website.
okay.
So there's no search mechanism like what the state does.
So it'll allow news sites, members of the public, et cetera, to search and then get all of the donations from a given individual or PAC or whatever, all there at once, instead of having to, let's say, I want to look at, if somebody wants to look at, a reporter wants to look at a given entity and see who that entity has donated to. There's no way to do that without having a search function. They would have to go through each individual PDF for each candidate for each election. So it just enhances that ability for the public and makes things more transparent.
I do know that Regina was going to be talking to MIT to see if there was anything we could do in terms of at least making that form a little bit more user-friendly, and also if it was possible to have some sort of search. If not for looking for a search for a potential donor, at least an easier way to pull up the names for a particular candidate at a certain time. So I know that she was going to be in touch with them and see what we could do.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your work, and I look forward to reading the full report.
Kendall Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. One, maybe two questions. One question about the returns of the ballots. I'm assuming there's no way, or you do not integrate with MVA, so it's not like an automatic process or something in there that if it comes back, it may not even be time enough to integrate it into motor vehicles.
You mean the addresses?
Yeah.
Yeah, the county is integrated with the MVA.
Oh, so, but this would be too late if they returned, say I mailed it tomorrow and tomorrow was the last day, it would be no way for me to get back the ballot. There would be, if I didn't change my own address,
Okay.
there wouldn't be enough time for me to get another ballot if I was derelict and try to.
Are you talking about like the upcoming primary?
Right,
Well,
the problem.
I can speak mostly to the municipal. If you realize that you didn't get a ballot, you wanted a mail-in ballot, is that what you're saying?
Right.
Okay, and you didn't get your application in, or you didn't file it, you can do that pretty much right up to Election Day. I mean, if it's Election Day, you can vote in person. But I can't remember off the top of my head, it's something like 2 or 3 days before an election. You can walk into the office here, into the election office, fill out an application, be given a ballot, and then you have the option of filling it out and voting right then. What boggles my mind is how many people walk out the door with it when they could have just voted right then. So there are mechanisms for that. What we don't have that the county has is, for instance, everybody, if you wanted a mail-in ballot, let's say you didn't get it, you could go into the county system now and it would say ballot mailed. And then you'd say, well, why don't I have my ballot? Or it may say ballot not sent yet, and then you would know it hasn't come yet. We don't have that ability at the municipal level
Okay.
to do that. We also don't have the technological ability to just automatically say, I want a mail-in ballot all the time. So with the upcoming election, we will be sending, the plan right now, which we're looking at, is that we will be sending out applications, mail-in ballot applications to all registered voters. And then the ones that say they want a mail-in ballot will receive a mail-in ballot. So I don't know if that actually answers your question or it's more.
Right. I just was trying to figure out how all of that worked without having to come in here but I understand how that process.
And there's, there's always the phone.
Right, and that's true, that's true. I don't know, this may be a really dumb, stupid question. We just had a community survey, a national community survey done, and I don't know, Ms. Buckland is ears perked up. I would assume, and I don't recall, there's nothing on there about, are you a registered voter or, yeah, okay. All right, and I didn't know if that would be even appropriate. I don't know. So it might just it would tune me into, oh my goodness, maybe I need to register to vote, or maybe I need to vote. I mean, I didn't know if that would be an appropriate question on there. This isn't my area of expertise.
It wasn't on the survey that went out, but of course we have that Engage platform and we have the ability to do follow-up surveying if that was something that was of interest to get a feel for what's the distribution of registered voters or something like that. That's something we can ask about.
I don't know. I don't know if that might somewhat increase voting, because it kind of heightens someone's attention. Go, oh my goodness, yeah, I guess I should be voting or something like that. But just a small thing.
No, I get it. I would just say, right, I think the state does a good job of trying to get new people to register. When you go to MVA
Right.
to renew your license, there's reminders, there's opportunities. So for some people, maybe they do it immediately when they see it, or they, but sort of those interactions with the state and sort of any state agency offers you sort of that information that here's an easy way to register. So
Right.
Sort of any platform of government that sort of suggests to people it's easy to register, I think is good, right? So
Right. So, there's so many ways that you can do it that if you miss it, you really shouldn't, I guess.
Yeah, but there is a big chunk of folks who are not registered at all, right? So
Right.
can't participate. So it is always a challenge, I think, of how do you get folks to register, especially younger folks, right? Who come of age and then are not really focused or plugged in. It's
Right.
a real
I
opportunity.
know Alderwoman Finlayson remembers we could do it in high school. They did it at Annapolis High. We just registered. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, it's one thing to have
And they
people
still do it.
registered. It's another to get them to vote and increase the turnout.
True. Yeah, that's true. And they continue to do that. So, yeah. So it's been going on a long time. But anyway, thank you all so much for all your hard work.
Alderman Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, interestingly enough, my neighbor's son turned 16, so got his driver's license and was able to register to vote. And so he came home with the voter registration card, and then later got a notice that said, "Oh, you have this. You're registered, but you can't vote yet. You're not," which was interesting for them to do it that way. But I guess it's good to get them on the books to get the notices.
Well, that was the purpose of it, to get them on the list, and then also to provide them the opportunity for things like community service. Because if you're a registered voter, you can be an election judge. And there's a real challenge with getting election judges. So even though they can't vote until they're 18, they can serve as an election judge. And some of the municipalities and different jurisdictions are allowing 16-year-olds to vote. That's why we included it on the survey,
I saw
to get
that,
a sense of that. Tacoma Park does it. There's a couple of others that do
People
it.
didn't like that idea though on the survey.
And then also the concept of non-citizen residents being allowed to vote. And again, we included those on the survey because those are at the national level, and we wanted to find out what our voters thought. So they spoke pretty loud and clear.
Yeah, they did. They did. I thought that was interesting.
I think they want those 16-year-olds because they can run faster, because it's such a dangerous job now, being an
That's
election.
right. Yeah, a few other questions. As far as moving the elections to match the county or feds, I'll have to read through this more and give it consideration. Personally, I do have some concerns still, because even, with our last election, I think, well, especially 2017, but 2021, and maybe my, former Alderman Pfeiffer over there could speak to the past elections, but from my perspective, it seemed like people were really super engaged in 2017, a little less so in 21. But 17 was interesting because, we had the 2016 federal elections and people were, well, especially in Annapolis, kind of upset with how that election went. So we did see an increase in engagement. A lot of groups popped up to create and hold candidate forums and debates, that kind of thing, like Action Annapolis. We had the caucus had events. We had all kinds of groups, and I thought that was good for our elections. I'm not sure if that would have happened if we were on the same year as the state or county or feds. It kind of provided that venting for our democracy, which I think turned out to be pretty helpful. And because I am worried about us getting overshadowed on being on one of the other ballots. I know we want to increase turnout, but I also think there's value in making sure people, when they're voting, are voting for the right reasons, as far as know the candidates, attend the events, because there aren't a bajillion events going on. And I also just think there's value in having more civic opportunities than less. But I'll certainly take a look at it.
Can I just offer one thought? I think you're right. Like, it's depending where you land on that is sort of how you feel about it, right? Like,
Yeah.
but I mean, we have now, right, a presidential election, a statewide Senate primary and general election that's going to be very heated. We have a congressional election here that's very heated in 2 other districts in the state, but we have county board of education seats going on that seem to be having a thriving campaign here. So it's all happening on the same ballot, right? So, like, you know, people seem to care about what's happening in the board of education elections, right? But they also care about what's happening in the president and the Senate. So it seems to be working in that case. It's maybe a contrary view, but.
Yeah, we could debate this for a while probably. But so another question on the voting for 2 recommendation. My first reaction was, well, I hadn't heard of that. And so I did give it some thought. But I was like, well, if you're going to be asking them to vote for 2, which is already a departure from normal procedure, did you consider having them look at ranked choice, or even more so, IRV, instant runoff voting, which you could essentially eliminate an entire election, just have one general with IRV. So you save money. And again, if you're already asking people to change behavior, why not ask them to do, like, is there any benefit to the 2 vote versus that IRV doesn't have, or ranked choice? Like, well, I'm just curious why you just stopped on that one.
Yeah, sure. So ranked choice, when you look at the outcomes, like the outcomes for ranked choice and this approval voting, this form of approval voting where you can vote for up to 2, you generally get pretty similar outcomes like in the real world. Like so it has a lot of the same benefits. Why it's preferable to ranked choice is like very expensive and very complicated to implement. So the county/state wouldn't implement ranked choice voting for Annapolis. I'm always positive, right? I don't know if we asked that question directly, but I think that would be highly unlikely for it to do. So I think ranked choice is, like I said, expensive, complicated, and the calculation for identifying the winner is not, I mean, it's intelligible, right? If you spend time trying to understand it, but for most citizens who have many other things going on, it's not always clear how a given candidate comes out on top. Whereas with something like this, where you can pick up to 2 candidates, it's fairly straightforward, and it's much easier to understand and much less expensive.
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, the counterpoint would be, if that's the better, personally, I think that's a better system. And I know Tacoma Park, much smaller jurisdiction, has been using it for a while. I think there's some others in Maryland, but I need to look that up. I know the entire state of Maine does it for all their elections, except for, I think, some of the federal.
I think we have to keep in mind how many unopposed positions we have.
I know.
So, I mean,
yeah.
you know, it's addressing a problem,
Well,
or not a problem, but it's addressing a situation that really doesn't fit right now.
well, not necessarily, because I think the problem with the 2 vote system is if you had 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, and then a third party, it potentially dilutes the unaffiliated vote or the third party vote, because people are always going to vote for, if it's a Democrat, they're going to vote for both the Democrats. But if it was only Democrat, Republican, unaffiliated, then you might get the Democrat who would vote for the Democrat and unaffiliated. But if they're always going to be 2 of the same party, then you're going to be throwing that unaffiliated out. Whereas with ranked choice, they might be a bit more willing to they might get the second, third vote more likely than just a 2-vote system, or at least their overall vote would be reflected, I think, a bit more accurately than just the 2-person.
Yeah, I don't know that. You know that better than
I mean, not sure I'm picking up exactly what you're getting at, but what this approval voting system would do, it would allow for those third parties to enter without, I shouldn't say without, it would mitigate the possibility that they would play the role of spoiler for the candidate that they're most closely aligned with when you have that pick two system. And it's effectively the same as ranked choice voting. Obviously slight variations, but it's basically a simpler form of ranked choice voting. And you get very, very similar outcomes as you do with ranked choice voting.
But you also still have 2 elections, which, again, to save, you're saying ranked choice would be more expensive, but if you eliminate an entire election, you could potentially save some money on.
I see. So you're saying eliminate the primaries altogether
Yeah,
and just
just
go
have-
straight to a general?
potentially just have
I mean,
one IRV.
Yeah, that's a thought. We didn't consider that. It's a thought, but then I guess you'd have to keep in mind in that election, there's going to be a lot of candidates in which people to potentially choose from, right? And then you could you might get choice overload where you have so many candidates in the general, whereas with this system where you have a primary, you're going to narrow it down to 2 candidates. Those two candidates can have debates. Voters can really get to know those 2 candidates before they make that final choice in the general. Whereas if you don't have that kind of winnowing process, you might have 10 candidates just on that general election ballot. And it might be hard for voters to identify and understand the positions of all the candidates.
But wouldn't that be an argument in itself then to go to nonpartisan? But that wasn't recommended, right?
No, that was recommended. We think a nonpartisan primary, blanket primary, where all candidates are listed in the primary on a single ballot would be optimal for the city. Yeah.
I thought there was a vote that you had about identifying as with a political party.
Yeah, right. So
Is that
there was like a
related to something
debate
else?
of like, would you then, you could have everyone running, not in partisan primaries, but you could list their party affiliation would be one step, right? Like it's all these sort of different steps towards sort of full on ranked choice, I would think, right? I look at, and and then the most immediate shortest step is just non-affiliated people can show up in a primary and say, I want to vote in the Democratic primary, say I want to vote in the Republican, and can pull a ballot in the primary, and then you get those people involved, right? So there's just a bunch of different steps. It's a question, how much appetite do you have to go towards away from what we've always had?
Yeah. Last question just has to do with adopting the state code. Is there a way, I'm a little hesitant to do that wholesale because I just feel like it might reduce some of our flexibility. And comparing it to some of our, what I know best, some of our environmental code, we've ran into problems when we've adopted state code by reference. It turns out better usually when we adopt, basically translate it into our own code because we can make changes and tailor it. But I guess, is there a third option as far as like adopting, referencing only certain parts of the state code as opposed to all of it? Like, I don't know, parts of the code that regard, voting machines or campaign finance reports, but not referencing and not adopting the rest of it? Is that potentially not? You understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, to a large extent, our code follows what was state code. And it just hasn't been updated to be consistent with state code. So there's a lot to be said for just referencing it, because if we don't have something in our code, we have to then refer to state code anyway. So, it's just a question of, do you want to patch what we have, or do you want a new set of clothes to some degree? I mean, we're not inconsistent with state code necessarily, but it gets a little, just even in terms of the way it's written. I mean, the way the code is written right now can be a little archaic at times.
Again, with going back to the environmental code, when we usually don't adopt that by reference, when they change Comar, adopt a new statute, change Comar, they tell us that we then have to update our local code to do that. It seems like that has not been happening with the election code. When the state updates their election code, we don't necessarily make those changes right away. Maybe because we do have that kind of autonomy, we don't have to match the state.
Well, we don't have to, is one answer. We're trying to a little bit, and for instance, taking out absentee voting from the code and implementing or putting in mail-in ballots is one way in which we're trying to do it.
That's all I have. Thank you. There's a lot in here, and I think a lot of good stuff for us to move forward with. So thank you.
Thank you, Alderman Savage. Just one comment, Alderman Pfeiffer. You indicated that it seems, and I think Ms. Leahy did too, there's a lot of excitement, I guess, for lack of a better word, with the Board of Education, but that might be due to the nationwide fervor of the Board of Board of Education elections.
It's a good point, but don't undersell the trouble we can get in on the city council here, where people will be paying all attention to you on the next ballot.
There's the saying that, you don't need a Democrat or a Republican to decide who's taking the trash out. But I think as we saw in the last election, the pressures from national and state and county is coming down to a local level. So I think we need to be very cognizant of that and not be naive to think that we're insulated. We see it in the terms of financing that's happening. We're seeing it in terms of the challenges that are being made. So we have this is a real opportunity for us to be able to self-determine where we want our elections to be. And again, what is best for the voter? What is going to be consistent, safe, accessible, and applicable towards them and meet their needs the most. So I think that's where the board is coming from.
I was a couple minutes late. Did you all address the security issue in your final report?
The task force didn't address it as such. I mean, we were conscious of it in our last election, and we work with the county the last time in terms of security. We haven't had any, at least for polling. On the polling days, we haven't had any issues. Sometimes the issue, in our last election, we had some issues at the canvas, but nothing before then.
Okay, all right, sounds good. Any other questions, comments? I do believe the agenda has been completed. Is there anything else for the good of the order? Going once, going twice. Oh, Ms. Buckland, you wanted to say something. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I gave an incomplete answer earlier, which is that the National Community Survey, it doesn't ask your registration status, but it does ask if you voted in your most recent local election. 75% of people said they did. I'm not sure how that matches up with your actual data, but it does ask something about it, but what it doesn't ask is, are you registered?
Okay. Well, if they voted, then I'm guessing they're registered. But anyway, okay, nothing else for the good of the order? Hearing nothing, this session has adjourned at 4:19 p.m. Thank you so much.